DEI programs, they're trying to accomplish what you're
Let
describing,
me
right?
let me give you
Yeah.
an example, right? I think what you're struggling with is like, why are they unable to do it?
Yeah.
Okay. So these trainings tend to be, and I've attended now dozens of them, very highly paid consultants, by the way, tend to tell you that white people see the world through a non color lens and people of color see the world through a racial lens. Now, that's bullshit. People of color don't see the world through a racial lens. It's reducing and reductive. Then it says things like certain traits are traits of white supremacy and white supremacy culture: being on time, being punctual is white supremacy culture, right? Being conscientious is white supremacy culture. This is nonsense. Yeah.
And so how do you make it clear that you are against DEI, but it's because you think it's ineffective and you want diversity, but you think DEI is a barrier to that? Amna Khalid, thank you so much for taking the time to connect today.
Thank you for having me.
For those who don't know, Amna is an associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton College. Amna, what got you interested in these topics in the first place? How did you get inspired to focus in these areas?
So, I'm originally from Pakistan, and I was always very concerned as a student in school that the history that I was learning about Pakistan seemed incredibly slanted. And it always me, and when I asked questions in class, I would often get shut down. It's a very nationally in curriculum. When I went to college, that was my first opportunity to see history from a different lens. And as someone who hated history in school, I came to love history in college. And it was really there. And I got really interested in South Asian history, thinking about British colonialism, India and Pakistan and their formation. And then I went to Oxford for my graduate work. And that's where I was really exposed to the field of history of medicine for the first time. I just followed my heart. So I was looking at the link between Hindu pilgrimage and disease in 19th century northern India. So that's how I got into these topics.
And where do the DEI initiatives fall? Do you think this is a push from the woke bureaucracy, or do you think that this is an essential initiative?
Yeah, that's a good question. To what extent should we be paying attention to diversity on in higher education? We should be paying a lot of attention to diversity. I think it's shameful that so many marginalized groups and underrepresented groups have been systematically excluded from higher education. So I'm firmly in favor of diversity, in great part because diversity brings diversity of thought. One of the reasons you think about identity diversity is usually people have had different lived experiences and come from different backgrounds. And putting those people together is enriching for our students and for learning. So I think diversity is key and is something we need to be paying attention to. But the question is, we definitely need to be paying attention to it. But I think the dominant model at most higher ed institutions is an intellectually vacuous and morally bankrupt model, which is very much kind of steeped in this kind of progressive ideology, which treats diversity, equity, and inclusion, it makes a mockery out of those values. And my colleague and I refer to what is in place at most higher ed institutions as Diversity Inc. to differentiate it from the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So things like mandatory diversity statements for hiring and promotion, anti-racism trainings, bias response teams. These are not effective measures, and these are a waste of time. They won't achieve anything. And you're beginning to see now, I think the tide is beginning to turn a little bit. MIT has said it won't use mandatory diversity statements anymore. So institutions are moving away from a few of these things, which had become gospel for a couple of years after 2020.
But help me understand this. So universities like MIT that you mentioned, they care about diversity just like you do, and their method for getting a more diverse student population was DEI. So they care about diversity. That's what they want to achieve, and their method was DEI. But what you're saying is that DEI is not a good method for achieving diversity. So where's the disconnect? Like, why is it that these universities seem to have a really just, appropriate, healthy initiative, and they're approaching it with something seems to strive to meet that initiative. So what's going on? Like, where's the gap?
Is it's so that's why I differentiate between DEI and DEI Inc., right?
Yeah.
So those values, what is in place is DEI Inc. DEI Inc. is a neoliberal model that relies on a particular way of instituting change and measuring it, which is totally dependent on metrics. And what it's trying to achieve is noble, but the method of achieving it is completely warped. Because the method, how do you do diversity, or these are really complex and difficult things. The best way to encourage this is actually education. It's not training. I made a short animated video about what is the difference between DEI and education. And you don't change hearts and minds through training, but you actually do it through real education. So if they're really invested in expanding diversity, I think there are a lot of other ways of doing it. So instead of using these ridiculous diversity statements, mandatory ones, which are a political litmus test, you could decide that you want to recruit professors or lecturers from unconventional institutions. So that does away with the prestige bias. So if you think about it, the vast majority of people who end up in the top 25 institutions look and think the same. But once you start putting a premium on looking at other institutions, you'll automatically start recruiting people from elsewhere. You think about faculty, I think cluster hires are a good thing where you do a concerted effort to hire people for a particular end, right? So if you're trying to do something on race relations, you do a bunch of appointments in that area, and then you systematically let it grow so that students have the benefit of having those faculty on campus. There are a lot of other kinds of approaches that can be used. And the most important approach, I think, is taking the intellectual capital on your own campus, which is your faculty, and giving them the responsibility for designing programming on campus, which is meaningful and deeply rooted in education. Not to hire these consulting companies that charge an arm and a leg and then bring in trainers who, frankly, have no idea about the complex issues that they're talking about. They reduce everything to a box checking exercise, and there's only one right answer. So in many ways, this kind of initiative is going against what higher education is about. We're supposed to teach students how to think. This teaches students what to think. It's doctrinaire and it's top down. It's not rooted in questioning and investigation.
You're saying, generally speaking, the way that universities approach DEI is counterproductive, and there's a much better way to do this. If you were made the president of MIT tomorrow and in charge of DEI and you're chairman of the board of the university, and they say, Amna, you have one day to institute a DEI, whatever you want to call it, DEI or diversity program. What are the practical things that you would engage students with to promote diversity?
Students and faculty?
Yeah.
The first thing I would do is I would get in touch with people in the anthropology department, history department, religion department, in the humanities, really, and the interpretive social sciences who teach these topics and find out what they're teaching and how we can harness what they have and tell them, okay, let's design something for our campus where you will all, but you have to incentivize this work, right? So I would say you get time off or you get paid extra to put your heads together and design a program for campus that is sustained and that isn't just something that you need to do for PR. And that would involve common reading, discussion groups, sitting watching a movie together. Like you build community and you have these conversations by actually building community. And that means having a common experience to share and talk about. And not telling students, here's a multiple choice question and what is the right answer, but rather getting them to think more in depth about these things. The second thing I would do is in terms of diversity, and if we're specifically talking about racial diversity and understanding what that means, I would ask that we make it premium on including history courses in the graduation requirement, because it's really about learning about the history of these things, about race relations, for instance, about gender relations, is actually really interesting and important to understand where these tensions are. You don't really appreciate them in depth unless you actually have that kind of historical education. So my approach to it would be very education based. And I think professors could also design something for students that would again be education based and even staff on campus. So that's how I would do my diversity initiative. The other thing I would do is get rid of microaggression training, bias response teams. These are not helpful things on campus.
One thing I'm having a hard time understanding, DEI programs, they're trying to accomplish what you're describing,
Let me
right?
let me give you
Yeah.
an example, right? I think what you're struggling with is like, why are they unable to do it?
Yeah.
One small example. Okay. So these trainings tend to be, and I've attended now dozens of them, very highly paid consultants, by the way, tend to tell you that white people see the world through a non color lens, and people of color see the world through a racial lens. Now, A, that's bullshit. People of color don't see the world through a racial lens. It's reducing and reductive. Then it says things like certain traits are traits of white supremacy and white supremacy culture: being on time, being punctual is white supremacy culture, right? Being conscientious is white supremacy culture. This is nonsense. This is basically saying people who are not white should be allowed to get away with ridiculous. We're not fostering the kinds of habits of mind and being that you need to be successful. Instead, it's making an excuse for doing things in a very ridiculous fashion. White supremacy culture sees things through an intellectual lens, and people of color are more into color commentary, and that's how they see the world. Then there are things like microaggression trainings, which are ridiculous, which dictate don't ask someone where they're from. That's offensive and it's a microaggression. So we had a student at Carleton, and he was from Morocco. And at some point, he confided in a colleague of mine that he was very distressed that after the microaggression training, when he came to campus, he was excited to share with his fellows what his background was, what his culture was, but nobody would ask him where he was from. So it actually shuts down that very important conversation. It makes it impossible to harness the benefit of diversity. So even though you've got people who might look different, but if you're dictating to them what you can and can't ask them, you're closing down avenues for conversation.
It's a big irony because I think that the intention of the DEI programs is probably a good intention, and it's ironic that they shut down conversation.
Just to interrupt,
Yeah.
road to hell is paved with good intentions. I don't doubt the intentions, right? And this is where it's important to do these things with great care of thought. Good intentions and knee jerk reactions are a recipe for disaster.
One thing I find concerning is that while DEI programs are stating that they want to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, ironically, if you were to say, "Oh, I'm so against those programs," people would think that you're against diversity, equity,
Yeah.
and inclusion. And that's this other piece of the irony that's happening now is there are people who are against DEI because they think it's ineffective or counterproductive. And so they're making statements like, "Oh, DEI is so bad or horrible or stupid or whatever." And then someone outside looking in will say, "What, are you against diversity? Are you racist?"
Yeah.
And so how do you make it clear that you are against DEI, but it's because you think it's ineffective and you want diversity, but you think DEI is a barrier to that?
Yeah, that's, one of the things I'd like to share is I face that all the time. I think a lot of people, when I speak out against it, are like, oh, so you're not in favor of diversity, which is a ridiculous thing for people to think and say, not least because they should be able to see the kind of rich diversity of experience that I am bringing to my job based on who I am and where I have had my education. This is precisely why my colleague and I differentiate. We don't say DEI when we're talking about the problematic measures. We say DEI Inc. because it is a very corporate approach towards diversity. And that's what we're trying to say. Corporate approaches can they can elicit compliance, but they don't change hearts and minds. And they can be a good PR move because you've checked the box and said, oh, we do this. But in essence, it's not a true commitment to those things. In order to have a true commitment to those things, it requires deep and sustained study and engagement and real conversations where people aren't scared to ask questions, where people have the patience to actually sit and deeply investigate topics and questions.
And speaking of the ability to speak freely and openly, is there a line of free speech when it comes to the college campus protests that have been happening? What's your overall take, starting with the protesters themselves? Should they be allowed to protest in the manner that they have been?
There's a range of manner. I think we should have the widest latitude for speech on campus prior to, as long as it's not harassment or isn't inciting direct violence. And institutions have policies for that already. These are not new things. They're already pre-existing policies for this. Should students be able to say from the river to the sea? Yes. The reason for that is it offensive to some people? Yes. But the question is, if we start limiting what students can say, it's a slippery slope argument. Then tomorrow, it's the other side that are going to say, we find it offensive if you say X, Y, and Z. So the point is not that we like particularly this speech. The whole point of free speech is that you protect it, even the speech that you dislike, right? Protest is your First Amendment right. You should be able to do it. Freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and freedom of speech. These things go hand in hand. And I do think that we shouldn't be limiting. I think other groups are free to say what they want to say, but we shouldn't be limiting what can and can't be said in protest.
I think where people would say that saying "from the river to the sea" might cross a line is if it does apply a call to violence, because there are limitations to free speech. You can't call out for
Yeah.
violence, right?
Yes, you can't. But if you read the legislation, if you read the Constitution, it's clear and imminent danger. So the bar for violence is very high. Now, from the river to the sea does not qualify. And some people might find it anti-Semitic, sure. Some people might intend it as anti-Semitic, sure. But does it meet the bar for it to be banned? No, because that bar is pretty high. And if we start doing this, then tomorrow people will say any other slogan, kinds of thing. It is political speech, is what I'm trying to say. Like during 2020, we heard so many people protesting and saying things like, fuck the police. Would then also people would say, oh, that's inciting violence. That's anti-police. That's saying that we're going to be violent against the police. So what we have to understand is that political speech, by definition, is meant to provoke. It's meant to get under your skin. It's trying to make a statement, right? But as long as it's not asking and inciting, is not harassment and is not inciting violence, I really do think that institutions have the obligation to preserve that realm of speech. They can tell the students that, listen, we had this at Carleton College, for instance. I know that some of our protesters used that language. And actually, some of our Jewish students told them that, hey, you can use it, but we don't really like it. And I think for the most part, they stopped using that phrase because they were like, we're not trying to, it's not our intention. But if it's falling that way, we've decided we won't use it that way. They decided to change it. But that's up to them. And I think that's up to any group protesting. We do not police speech, because the minute we start policing speech, everything is up for grabs.
So the threshold is if it's explicitly directly calling for violence now. What would you say to a student who claims that "from the river to the sea" is necessarily calling for violence right now? You would say it's not.
It's not. It's a highly interpretive statement. And this is where education comes in. I think the key thing that universities can do right now in this particular moment is to hold more and more teach-ins, is to actually encourage conversation, have panel discussions. Our role is to educate. And this is precisely what we should be doing, telling students that river to the sea can be anti-Semitic. I'm not denying that. It can be understood to be, but it is protected speech still.
It's interesting that you said some of the protesters at Carleton chose not to use that slogan because it offended people that they didn't want to offend. That was one of my first thoughts around this. As you're protesting for a ceasefire, you're protesting for peace for Palestine. Why on earth would you use language that might be seen as racist? I don't get it.
That's a choice protesters make. Protesters choose, I'm not going to defend their use of the language. I just defend their right to be able to use it. These are different choices different groups make. Many groups have made other kinds of choices, which are also highly offensive. So the point to me, people make all kinds of calculus. And for some people, maybe they are trying to be obnoxious and offend. So I don't defend the content, but I defend their right to be able to say it, because as it stands, it's an interpretive question. And yes, some people might say, you see it and it offends you, but I don't care about what you think. I'm making this claim because other people don't think that.
And regarding speech and how it can shut down conversation, with regards to cancel culture, are there times when people do deserve to be canceled? Surely there's things that people can say that are so horrible that they should get in trouble for saying that, right?
So there are two things here, right? When we're talking about free speech, and First Amendment protects censure from the from the state, it's protection from the state. What you're talking about, cancel culture, is more about social censure. It's about when your peers or the people you hang out with decide they no longer want to be. To be honest, that's a choice that any group can make. There's no law against it. And I think there may be certain situations in which it's egregious enough to warrant that's for that particular group to decide. But I will say it should be rare, Because once you begin that practice, again, it's a slippery slope. You're going to go down very quickly into a situation where people will start self censoring because of the fear of being canceled. And there is nothing that eats the space for discourse. It hollows it out from the inside like fear does. And that drives self censorship. So I think there are that people could say that may lead to their peers not wanting to engage with them and shutting them down. Whether I think that's a good practice? No.
I agree that fear is a culprit behind so many bad things that happen. I just thinking if we're not scared at all, we're gonna get blindsided. But if we have an overreaction to something, then it
So
prevents us from
here's
having appropriate empathy.
Yeah, and here is what I would say. What's dangerous to me, again, looping back to what we started our conversation with respect to higher education, is that there is now this push to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism for college campuses. And this is again a push that is coming from legislature. And this is the single most destructive thing that will happen for study of these issues in their entirety. It will be very detrimental to Jewish people as well, because it will actually make it impossible to talk about anti-Semitism in a robust way that we can in a way we can teach about it. This definition is overly expansive. And in fact, the person who was the lead author on it, who is a professor at Bard College, has come out on the record and said this was never intended to be used on higher ed campuses because it will stifle the freedom to think about these issues. So, this is another place where I think there is a legislative push to adopt something that is going to be deeply undermining and eroding academic freedom.
What does the legislation state?
It's a proposal that states adopt that definition. So you can look it up. It's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, but it's a very expansive definition, which kind of makes the kinds of things that you and I are talking about, which are interpretive, it categorically says they're anti Semitic. So basically, a lot of behavior which should be protected will no longer, behavior and speech will no longer be protected, which means essentially that you'll shut down any kind of good discussion about these things, even. It'll become harder and harder to teach about these things. And again, but I'm putting the intention aside. You put the intention of the lawmakers aside, but it's very dangerous what it's going to do. Just like with divisive concepts, or just like with ideas of from whatever ideology they may be coming from, which dictate what you can and can't talk about. Because people start self-censoring, people will stop teaching these topics. People will stop teaching the Holocaust, and that is not good for anyone in the world for us to stop learning about it.
Why would the legislation make people stop learning about the Holocaust?
Let me give you an example, right? Because it says, and people interpret it which is prudent because you want to preserve your job. But if you will not advance anti Semitic concepts, which means that you can't read Mein Kampf if we are in that situation. Now, reading Mein Kampf is important. Reading those primary documents is actually exceptionally important. And you know what those documents are? Those documents are anti-Semitic. But you're teaching them not to promote anti-Semitism. You're teaching them precisely. For historians, it's absolutely impossible to teach if we have restrictions on what concepts we can even advance in the classroom. We don't endorse them. And we've become a stupid nation where we've forgotten the distinction between articulating something and endorsing it, such that there is this idea that the moment you introduce such an idea or such a document, it's going to infect the students. And it's also highly patronizing and condescending to students because they are able to engage critically and make up their own mind. So that's one example. I've heard students, this is not with regard to the IHRA definition. But students who October 7th have been very upset with historians who are teaching the Holocaust, saying, why are you giving us all these primary materials? These are anti Semitic. And you can't study the Holocaust without encountering anti Semitic material. And I would argue that it would greatly impoverish us as human beings if we stopped teaching and learning about the Holocaust.
What an irony that in an attempt to stop anti-Semitism, you, you'd be blocking education, and
This
thereby
is,
the way to block anti-Semitism is through education. You don't want to block
this is the
education.
point, right?
Yeah.
No attempt to censor is ever going to, no matter how good the intention, is ever going to pan out that way because it fundamentally there's an equal and opposite reaction, or it does something where you have things go underground, they don't go away.
What's a view you hold that you wish more people understood?
That's a good question. I've never been asked that. What's a view I hold that I think more people understood? Uh, that you can, the principle is that you can, like you said, hold two contradictory thoughts, or you can condemn two things and still be condemn things on both sides. I think in this moment, I would say, because it's so polarized, that I can condemn what the right is doing and the left is doing at the same time and see them both as bad. I don't feel the need to, and nor should one feel the need to, if you're condemning one side, necessarily associate oneself to the other side. So, this binary logic, you're either with us or against us, quoting George Bush, has infected American public discourse and is in great part responsible for furthering the polarization.
My theory on why people tend to think that way, you can tell me what you think, is because it's so much easier. It's so much it's intellectually dishonest, but it's so much emotionally easier to think that one side is right, one side is wrong, the world is simple, and if the Democrats are stupid, then you should be Republican. And but
So,
that's not how the world is. It's a lot. It takes a lot more emotional strength to say to condemn Hamas and to condemn Netanyahu.
yeah, and the thing is, frankly, it shouldn't take so much given you can see the atrocities and but we're living in times where you're totally right. People just want a simple solution. And this kind of binary thinking takes the responsibility, this kind of binary logic takes the responsibility of thinking of you. Someone does the thinking for you. Now, and that's very dangerous. That's what we teach our students to do, which is to think independently, precisely so that nobody else takes over their thinking from them and does it for them, because that's what authoritarian states do.
What advice would you give to people on how to think critically about these issues?
I would say read extensively and read perspectives from various sides. There are not two sides to an issue ever, there's more than two. And don't let someone do the thinking for you. Have conversations. Seek out, in particular, those who disagree with you and try and understand why they disagree with you. Not necessarily because they're going to change your mind, but it'll give you a more nuanced understanding of your own position. So I would strongly advise people in general at all times to regularly read Animal Farm and George Orwell's 1984. Those are two books that don't get old for a reason. They will always speak to us because they speak to a human instinct to censor things that we don't like. This is in all of us. It takes, you actually have to go against your nature to keep the space open for free speech. So because it's not intuitive, it takes hard work to preserve that. So I would argue for my students and for students everywhere, read extensively, read about the topics that are hot topics from different points of view. But in general, I would say regularly revisit Animal Farm. It never gets old, and it even if you've read it in middle school, you'll read it with a different eye if you read it today.
As a professor at Carleton, do you feel censored? Are you caught in that?
Nobody in the world can censor me, but
Oh,
that's because I'm constitutionally incapable of keeping my mouth shut.
ah.
But have I paid a social cost for speaking up? Yes. I think there are people who've distanced themselves from me. Some of them are coming back round and now wanting to, they're like, oh, I think I now see what you were saying. So that's wonderful. It's always nice to have friends come back. Institutionally, I have not had nobody has tried to curtail what I say.
So you haven't been victim of the censorship. Why not? I thought that the universities were cracking down on some speech.
I don't know, but I think
Yeah.
part of it is that I'm not white.
Oh.
And I think it's harder to crack because of the kind of um, crass identity politics of our times. Um, it's harder to shut down in progressive spaces people of color. I hate that term, but I'll just use it for the time being. And I think that's actually why I personally feel a great responsibility to speak up against the kinds of illiberalism I see on campus and outside, because I think it's much harder for people to dismiss me in a way that they can dismiss white colleagues.
What was you said you've lost some people have turned away from you because of one of your views. What was a view you held that made people
My critique of DEI Inc. I think alienated a lot of my colleagues, or they became far more cautious towards me because I think they thought I wasn't It's the same kind of conflation, like, oh, she's anti-diversity, or she's in our neck of the woods, like on campus, it's, oh, she's a right winger, unbeknownst to them that my politics is probably far more left than any of theirs. But it's that inability to see that someone can be criticizing something in its current formation or iteration, but doesn't mean that they're rejecting the values. That requires a certain open. People are scared. People don't want to be, in great part because of cancel culture, because it's so easy for people to get labeled racist, sexist, white supremacists, that people, and nobody wants that. I don't want that either. So it silences people. The fear silences people.
And you'd say to them, "No, I'm not against diversity. I just don't think that DEI is handling it appropriately. Here's how I think we should handle it." And your friends or colleagues still said, "No, we still think you're racist?"
I think oftentimes what I've found is that there's not enough space on campus to have these conversations more broadly. So I don't think I often got to the point of here's a way to do it differently, though I did try in my writings and things. But I think mostly it's not, I personally don't feel shut down. But I do think that the space to speak with your colleagues in an official forum is not very, it's not vast. And I think there is, speech is controlled not necessarily by shutting people down, but by controlling what can and can't be on the agenda and how much time it'll be given.
Before we started recording, you mentioned the various threats to higher education. You
Mhm.
mentioned state legislation. What do you see as the biggest threat right now to higher education?
I'd say threats to higher education are coming in different forms and from different directions. So there's certainly the threat that's coming from within the academy, and then there's the very concerted attempt to curtail academic freedom and to really control what professors can and cannot teach in their classrooms. And that's something that you're seeing in red states, particularly in states like Florida. Alabama has recently passed a bill. So I think state legislation and those threats are especially concerning to me because state intervention in higher education makes a political football of education. I come from Pakistan where we've done that and our public education has subsequently been ruined. And I didn't move halfway across the world to see exactly those trends taking hold over here. So those are the kinds of things that concern me most prominently from outside the academy right now.
And which legislation in particular worries you?
Sure. So about a couple of years ago, my colleague Jeff Snyder and I, we got a grant to work on these anti-CRT bills that were coming. And as we started working, the idea was that we would spend the year looking at this legislation across the country. But by the time we actually started the grant, what happened is that the legislation from Florida was proliferating like mad. It was like drinking from a fire hose trying to keep track of it. So we decided to focus on Florida. And at that point in time, it was the Stop Woke Act, which was the most concerning thing. In great part, it defined these 8 divisive concepts, which it then says cannot be taught in college classrooms. Now, before I go on to talk about this, it's important to say that I think one of the things that has made American higher education the envy of the world is academic freedom, which has been protected very strongly in the United States. And for your listeners, if you like, can define what academic freedom is,
What is it?
so it's the freedom of professors to research without any kind of political pressure or institutional pressure. It's the freedom to teach freely according to the guidelines of your discipline, but again, not subject to any kind of pressure from outside. And then the third aspect of it is professors' ability to speak as citizens independent of their teaching and research. So it's the first two that I'm primarily concerned about vis-a-vis state intervention. And the Stop Woke Act basically outlined 8 concepts that are that it calls divisive concepts. And essentially, what those concepts are trying to do is they're trying to limit any discussion of slavery or to limit discussion of white supremacy, controversial around race and about gender. So in brief, this is what these divisive concept legislation is trying to do. And the Stop Woke Act, once it was proposed, was actually challenged. And it was challenged by a professor and a student. Other people have challenged it too, but these are the two that I'm most familiar with. Professor Adriana Novoa, and there's a student who challenged it. And when it went to court, the judge actually put an injunction on it. It's a temporary injunction, said this cannot be put into place. So while we were doing our research, the injunction was active. The law had not yet come into power, but already it was having a chilling effect on what professors felt they could teach and speak publicly about. This is
What was the stated intention of that legislation?
the way it's crafted is that there is a overtake of higher ed institutions by woke ideology. And woke ideology is teaching students to hate America and is sowing seeds of division. And that this kind of ideology must be resisted through legislation. So that's the kind of basic outline of it. And bear in mind, this is all happening at the same time as the the Don't Say Gay Act in Florida. So this is a concerted effort, which interestingly it's been in the making for a while, and it's a number of think tanks. I would name Manhattan Institute, Goldwater Institute, Heritage Foundation, which has people working on this kind of model legislation, which is being pushed in red states. So in Florida, Ron DeSantis is the one who is championing this. And this legislation, which is, like I said, there's an injunction against it, is already having a chilling impact on what people think they can teach in the classroom. It applies to K through 12 and
But the
higher education.
legislation is against woke, and you're saying the legislation is preventing people from but I thought the legislation would be to open up what professors can talk about.
That's how it's framed. Right, that's how it's framed, that it's to prevent professors from teaching what they see as divisive concepts or from what they see as indoctrination. But what it is in reality is another kind of indoctrination. So it's not necessarily trying to fight indoctrination by opening up room for discussion and education. It's actually trying to push the opposite political agenda.
I
So let me be clear, I'm not in favor of the woke agenda either, or that position. I think one of the things that confuses people when they're dealing with me is I have no team, so I just take a principled stance. People find that difficult in our times when things are so polarized, and people tend to have that kind of tribal mindset where they're either for or against something.
I think people have a hard time holding two seemingly conflicting ideas in their head at once.
Yeah, our ability to be okay with ambiguity or uncertainty, or to just be able to see the gray, has deteriorated considerably.
So what do we do about the legislation?
There is an injunction against the Stop Woke Act, and the state has appealed it. So I believe the oral arguments of the appeal are going to be heard this month. Maybe they're even being heard as I speak. I'm not quite sure. But what I was going to tell you is that my colleague and I ended up writing an amicus brief in support of the plaintiffs. So the plaintiffs are the student and the professor who are challenging this act. And that was quite an interesting process. And we were very fortunate to be asked. We felt very honored to be asked to write one. And in that brief, we outlined how this kind of legislation is going to fundamentally push us towards, or push professors towards, educational malpractice. That was our basic argument, that it's going to ask us to teach things in ways that is not true, and there's no integrity. I'm particularly concerned about this legislation also because 70+% of the American professoriate is adjunct or contingent faculty. So, for your listeners who might not understand what these terms mean, these are faculty who are not on the tenure track and are not tenured. So, they have contracts, part time contracts, visiting contracts, but they're limited term contracts. And they teach and they have no job guarantee. What is interesting to note is that given that 70+% of the professoriate is adjunct, they are very fearful all the time of losing their jobs.
Hmm.
The freedom to teach in a way that they can discuss with integrity controversial topics is fundamentally curtailed when the state legislation is threatening things like, if you go against the legislation, you're going to get fired. So it really constrains what people are being able to teach. And already in Florida, we went and spoke to dozens of faculty, and people are dropping courses and they're just nixing it from their offerings because they don't want to be fired. And the end losers in this situation, it's not the professors, it's actually the students. generation.
And the woke movement was to get more attention to these topics, and you're saying this legislation was a reaction to that that's shutting them down. So it's ironic because they're claiming that wokeness is closing the conversation,
Yeah.
and what they're doing in response is also closing the conversation.
Yeah, very much so. In fact, it would push us to teach in ways that are not appropriate.
Yeah.
Um, the woke movement, I just want to be very clear. It's not like this concerted movement. It's this kind of there. I will grant that there is the academy leans liberal and left, professors and faculty. And I think there is a progressive doctrine that has taken hold of discourses on campus. So I'm not denying that fact. I don't want to be, again, I'm not partisan. And we certainly, do we need reform in higher education? Yes, we do. There's no question about it. But that reform has to be internally driven. It cannot be state mandated. Even with the best intentions and the best laws, once you open the door for higher education and content that is being taught to be dictated by the state, it's a short jump, skip, and a hop away from full time authoritarianism. And this is how it starts. It begins with very tiny things that people think, oh, okay, I think this is okay. This kind of censorship or limitation is fine. But before you know it, it's a very slippery slope and you've got full blown censorship taking place.
So what is your stance? So you think the legislation ultimately is bad, but the ideology that maybe instigated it, the woke ideology, is also bad, right? What do you think is the answer for to how do we remove these threats from higher education?
Listen, these threats to higher education that are coming from within the academy, these are not, they weren't hatched yesterday. Like this has been happening. And to be honest, I don't think it's not a concerted movement like we see from legislation. So this is something that has been happening within the academy. It is a problem. It's a cultural problem. What we need is a cultural shift, and cultural shifts don't take place by diktat. So the way to deal with this is that it has to come from within the academy. And I think it is happening. There are organizations that are working to change this. I think institutions are now beginning to realize the importance of some of the core values and principles. So let me give you an example. I think the situation in Gaza and the encampments on college campuses have really brought to the fore the importance of free speech for education. Many of the people who were earlier campaigning for limiting speech because it was offensive or hurtful have come to realize that these kinds of limitations will backfire and will chill their speech as well. So there is already, I believe, a shift taking place. And I think there are a lot of professors from within the academy who are speaking out against this culture and are trying concertedly to change how things are done on campus. So again, the reason I say it's a cultural shift, it takes time, but I don't believe that the state has any role interfering.
And what is your stance ultimately? Are you a free speech absolutist? Do you think that people should say whatever they want to on campus? Or what do you think would be ideal as a stance for schools to take?
Yeah, speech on campus, and this is something that I think isn't very discussed in the public discourse right now. People are criticizing these encampments, and then people are criticizing the responses to them. I think the first thing to understand is that there are two core values, right? One is academic freedom, which I explained to you, and then the other one is free speech. They're different. Academic freedom isn't the liberty to say whatever you want to say, wherever you want to say it. Academic freedom means that what you're presenting is based and grounded in expertise, and that you are presenting it with evidence. So it's not, you can't walk into a classroom as a geologist and say the earth is flat, because that is not something that is supported by your disciplinary wisdom. So what I would say is that within the classroom, the norm has to be academic freedom. So students can't just say anything. You can't suddenly start protesting. You can't suddenly start mouthing off, and there's no ad hominem attacks or any of that kind of stuff. And I think by and large, in classrooms, things have been fine. There has not been trouble except for maybe one or two cases. But given the the large industry that higher education in the US is, those are very few instances. Now, when it comes to I think students have every right to free speech on the college quad, on the green. Over there, students can protest. And frankly, their speech over there doesn't have to be grounded in expertise. And there's great value in institutions, room for both academic freedom and free speech. In great part, higher education has two missions. One is to train critical thinkers for the production of knowledge, and the other one is to train citizens. Now, protest is a key part of citizenship. Learning how to exercise your First Amendment right is critical to learning what it means to be a citizen in the United States. So, students need practice. This is why institutions actually allow free speech. I'm talking about private institutions, not public institutions. They have to do it because they're public. But even private institutions, the latitude is pretty wide or should be pretty wide on the quad and on the campus green, whereas in the classroom, it should be dictated by academic freedom.
My last question regarding the threats to higher education and the new state legislation is, what would it mean if Trump does get elected, do you think?
I think Trump has made no bones about what he wants to do if he gets elected. He definitely wants to go after private institutions and their endowments. He wants to tax them more heavily. He wants this kind of loan guarantee system where institutions that produce scholars who are unable to pay their student loans are then responsible for paying the loans on behalf of their students. This will be the ruination of private universities completely. He's talked about an online university, I can't remember the exact name, but that would be free for everyone. And somehow that's going to be a substitute for in-person education and public education. And these so just in terms of quality, I think that the kind of thing that's being proposed is it's not education. It's like a cheap caricature of it. But I think the kind of legislation that will come in, I think these kinds of act like Stop Woke Act will certainly curtail academic freedom of professors. And I think there is an attempt to make state institutions in particular these off the state. And these are the kinds of things we have seen happen historically in places like the Soviet Union, in places that have had authoritarian regimes in Latin America, in Pakistan, in India, even, which is the largest democracy in the world, but only in name, as we know, even with the current elections. It is a state of, it's an authoritarian democracy. And education has been used as a mouthpiece for the state.
Do you think there's any merit to what Donald Trump is proposing, or what would he say is his reasoning?
To be honest, it's very hard to say what Donald Trump would say because he's the most inconsistent and he turns on a dime. There is no thinking involved in what he's saying. He blows with the wind wherever it needs to go. So I'm afraid I can't really say what he would say. I have no idea. And that's a mind I would like to not get into. I don't think there's much to get into over there. He would probably say the same kinds of things that he said before. All of this kind of legislation is based on the executive order that he introduced, which was to ban DEI trainings for state staff. And so much of the divisive concepts are coming from there. I don't really know what he would say, but he would say things like, this is divisive, it's dividing our nation, let's make America great again. This education system is corrupting and indoctrinating our kids, so we need to get rid of it. What we need to pay attention to is what the likes of Christopher Rufo will do, because Trump, as far as I'm concerned, in this arena is really just a mouthpiece for some other people who are smart and highly manipulative, very disingenuous. In fact, Christopher Rufo has made no bones about the fact that he thinks institutions of higher education have been taken over by a political ideology, and he is committed to making sure that the conservatives now lay siege to these institutions and take it over. So he's not even pretending like it's about education. That's just the outward rhetoric. But he's on record for saying that he thinks that institutions should be towing the line of conservatives.
I spoke to Harvey Silverglate recently. Harvey Silverglate is the attorney to Donald Trump's attorney, and he was saying that if we could eliminate a lot of these faculty roles, that students could pay less in tuition and universities would function more freely. And what Harvey said, I hope I'm not misquoting him, was that so students would pay less and it would unlock greater freedom of speech because you'd have less inhibition or less censorship from administrators. Do you agree with that? Because I know that you believe in strengthening freedom of speech at universities. Do you agree that I guess that what I'm trying to connect where I'm trying to connect the dots is to say that is there any merit in something like what Trump may be proposing by reducing bureaucracy in universities, thereby helping students and free speech?
Listen, I don't have the data on me right now. If you want, I can send it to you. But the growth of bureaucracy in higher education is like the plague. Over the last few decades, we have seen an absolute explosion of administrative units on college and university campuses, which, frankly, a lot of the money is going in that direction. And often, I'm quite happy to be on the record to be saying this. I know a lot of people are not happy to go on the record to say this, but I think often the problem is that the people who are in these administrative positions, particularly positions, I'm talking here about student life kinds of positions, so who have a lot of interaction with our students, they are coming out of ed schools where the progressive ideology definitely has taken hold, right? So those are the people who tend to push this. They have a lot more contact with our students than we as professors do. So I would say we need to pay attention to those administrators and see why is it that there is so much money going into what is essentially administrative bloat in higher education. Insofar as we need to curtail administrators, yes, but what we need to do is invest in faculty, have and reduce this reliance on adjunct faculty, because that is not going to help people speak freely. We need to reinstitute and protect academic freedom and tenure. That is critical. One of the reasons professors have tenure is precisely that they're able to speak out without fear of any kind of recrimination. So, insofar as the bureaucracy needs to be reduced, yes. Do faculty need to be reduced? No. In fact, faculty have substantially been reduced over the period of time because faculty lines keep getting cut all the time. Meanwhile, administrative lines keep getting added without any consideration or hitch.
Would you and Donald Trump both agree that administrators should be cut from universities, that universities should decrease the amount of administrative employees and bureaucracy that are in the university?
I don't know if Donald Trump and I would agree. If yeah, I haven't seen his exact
Yeah.
position on, but yes, I think there is an administrative bloat on campuses, and I think that needs to go down. But I think that alone won't cut it. That is one piece of the equation. I think more needs to be invested in actual teaching and faculty, and to make sure that your students continue getting the quality education that the U.S. is known for. It requires reducing reliance on contingent faculty and allowing people, opening up more tenure track lines and allowing them to get tenure.
Got it. Thank you so much for the time. This was amazing talking to you. I'm going to end the recording and then maybe we could wrap up for 30 seconds.